York, this is Democracy Now!
We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us.
While the United States, Britain, and other wealthy nations race to vaccinate their populations, a new report finds as many as 9 out of 10 people in dozens of poorer countries could miss out on the vaccine until at least 2022, because wealthy countries are hoarding enough doses to vaccinate their entire populations between 3 and 5 times over. We'll look at the growing movement to develop a people's vaccine. Then we speak to one of the world's leading infectious disease doctors, Paul Farmer, the co-founder of Partners in Health.
Well, I mean, we are facing the consequences of decades and decades of underinvestment in public health and of centuries of misallocation of funds away from those who need that help most.
Dr. Paul Farmer will talk about the pandemic, healthcare inequality, and his new book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History. All that and more coming up. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the United States, Britain, and other nations begin unprecedented mass vaccination campaigns to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, other parts of the world may not have access to vaccines for months, if not years. A new report finds as many as 9 out of 10 people in dozens of poorer countries could miss out on the coronavirus vaccine until at least 2022. Because wealthy countries, including the United States, are hoarding enough doses to vaccinate their entire populations between 3 and 5 times over. The report was issued by the People's Vaccine Alliance, which includes Amnesty International, Frontline AIDS, Global Justice Now, and Oxfam. This is Winifred Byanyima, Executive Director of UN AIDS, in a video produced by the People's Vaccine Alliance.
Huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
That was the UN AIDS Executive Director, part of the People's Vaccine Alliance. The World Health Organization has also warned about the inequitable distribution of the vaccine. This is WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
We simply cannot accept a world in which the poor and marginalized are trampled by the rich and powerful in the stampede for vaccines. This is a global crisis, and the solutions must be shared equitably as global public goods, not as private commodities that widen inequalities.
In early December, Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to 2 guests about the calls for a people's vaccine. Dr. Moga Kamal Yaneh, joined us from Oxford, England. She's policy advisor to the People's Vaccine Alliance. She worked for decades on access to medicines and healthcare in developing countries. And Achal Prabhala joined us from Bangalore, India, where he's coordinator of the Access IBSA project, which campaigns for access to medicines in IBSA. That's India, Brazil, and South Africa. He recently co-authored an op-ed published in the New York Times headlined, "Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights." I asked Dr. Moga Kamalyane to talk about the call for a people's vaccine.
Well, the People's Vaccine is a coalition of organizations like Amnesty, Frontline AIDS, Global Justice, Oxfam. It's co-led by Oxfam and UNAIDS, and it has so many people, academics, health activists, health experts, NGOs, patient groups from all over the world, united for one aim, which has a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine. So we want a vaccine. Basically, we're calling for vaccination that that is available for all people at risk, and then for everybody once we have enough doses. But not the way it's happening now, where if you happen to be born in a rich country, you get the vaccine. If you happen to be born in a poor country, you don't. And I mean, yesterday in the UK, they started vaccinating older people, and there was some clapping, and it was a lot of joy. And of course, that's brilliant, that there is hope that this problem that we're all suffering from will be, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. However, that joy is only limited to people living here. I've got friends and relatives and people that I work with in other countries, in developing countries, who are saying, yeah, and what about us? And yeah, what about them? So this is really a big problem. There's just so many. It's kind of dividing the world between those who have and can pay and those who don't and can't pay. And therefore, well, you can stand in the back of the queue. We don't know when you can get the vaccine. And that is just not right. It's not right on moral grounds. It's not right on public health grounds, because everybody's saying nobody's safe until everybody's safe. Yeah, okay. How do you make everybody safe? So a vaccine nationalism will not get you to everybody's safe. And also on economic ground, you're not going to get the economy growing if just one, or back to normal, if one country vaccinates its population and the rest of the world isn't. You can't trade with people who are sick, or people who have high level of infection. So it just doesn't make sense at all. The other important point is that this is not kind of fact of life that we have limited amount of vaccines. Actually, that's not the case. There are other options that will enable the world to produce more vaccines and therefore vaccinate more people. So basically what's happening now, if you can imagine that we have a small pie, so that's one vaccine, a small pie, and so basically the rich can have the bigger share of it, and then we'll have just crumbs left for developing countries. While the idea is why don't we increase the pie so everybody can have a decent share of it, rather than fighting on a little one?
Well, Dr. Kamalyane, I wanted to ask you about the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and how access to that vaccine may be more equitable at this stage. Could you talk about some of the agreements that the AstraZeneca has reached with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance?
Well, basically, I mean, this vaccine has been developed by Oxford University. Oxford University had a standard on managing intellectual property, and it actually talks about open license. However, when they did the deal or the contract with AstraZeneca, it became exclusive license for AstraZeneca. But they managed to put some conditions in the contract about making the vaccine accessible to developing countries. So AstraZeneca went to one of the big vaccine producers in India, the Serum Institute, and made an agreement to produce 1 billion doses. So that's vaccinating 500 million people. Half of them will be in India. So it's a good way, good start to make more vaccines available. AstraZeneca also has some agreements with other countries, like with Argentina and Brazil, so that may cover a number of people in Latin America. But what about the rest of the population? There's some other deals with countries, but not production as such. You can't leave, so AstraZeneca compared to others, yes, they've done good things, and also fixing the price as, AstraZeneca said $4 per dose, and Serum said $3 per dose. For developing countries, it will be probably $3 per dose, so $6 per course or per person. But the thing is, you can't leave, this is the whole thing, you can't leave the decision on supply, price, which country, which patient, to companies. That's not their job. Their job is to produce. And the job of governments is to make more production. So you have to enable other producers, like in India, there's other producers. Other countries would have other producers. So if you allow technology transfer, so sharing technology, which the technology, by the way, a lot of it has been developed by public money, including from the US and the UK and Europe and other countries. So allowing the sharing of technology and removing the intellectual property barrier, so no patents on vaccines, then other companies can produce the vaccine, and we have more. And just like AstraZeneca did this contract with Serum that includes presumably technology transfer or some technology transfer, that can be done on a multilateral level, on a bigger level for more companies. Because all these deals, by the way, they're all secret. You don't know what's in it except what they announce. Rather than if you have a multilateral agreement, you don't, the negotiation happens in closed door. But then once they agree a license, then it's public. Then you see what's good and what's bad about it.
I wanted to bring Achal Pravala into the conversation, again, coordinator of Access IBSA project, which campaigns to access medicines for India, Brazil, South Africa. This piece you recently wrote in the New York Times, Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights. You're joining us from Bangalore, India. Can you talk about what that would mean if you suspended intellectual property rights? Talk about trade secrets, talk about patents, talk about government subsidies of these private companies, and how does what's happening now, the development of this vaccine, compare to people's access, for example, to the flu vaccine, how that was developed and financed?
Thank you, Amy. Firstly, it's great to be here, and thank you for having me. The piece that we wrote in the New York Times was geared around an event that's unfolding this week and the next. It doesn't look like it'll get resolved anytime soon or successfully, but that event is a proposal that South Africa and India made at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization, to temporarily suspend a trade rule called TRIPS, which is an agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, the super governance of intellectual property worldwide, which the WTO takes on. And the reason India and South Africa suggested that all member countries of the WTO should be exempted from provisions of TRIPS is so that everything that we require to survive the pandemic, the masks, the test kits, but now especially the vaccines, should be free to be made in as much capacity as possible to get them faster and cheaper to as many people as we can around the world. There is an overwhelming support from developing countries for this proposal, but the WTO works on consensus, which means that even if 5 or 6 very rich countries oppose the proposal, it actually won't pass. And that's exactly what's happening. The US, the EU, the UK, and a few other rich countries, as well as inexplicably Brazil, have opposed this proposal and are stalling it, which means that it's unlikely to go through without a fight. Now, the irony of the fight having to take place this week is there's really good news out of the UK. there's also really good news out of science. And personally, for me, sitting in India, I wish I could share in that good news with the same spirit of cheer and celebration. I saw a moving interview with a 91-year-old called Martin Kenyon in London, who called his hospital, said, "Hey, I heard you had vaccines." They said, "Yes, come on over and get one." He walked over and he got a Pfizer vaccine, the first dose of a Pfizer vaccine, and he's looking forward to hugging his grandchildren this Christmas, and it's a beautiful, touching story. The problem with that is that Pfizer vaccine, over 90% of its supplies until the end of 2021, so that means for the next 13 months, have been sold out to a handful of rich countries, to the US, to the EU, and to the UK. There's actually no way that anyone in India or anyone anywhere outside these rich countries is going to get their hands on one of these vaccines for love or for money. They just don't exist outside a very few number of rich countries. That's kind of amazing to live through in 2020. I've been campaigning for access to medicines for a long time, but my father had COVID. He's 87 years old. My mother is 72 years old. I definitely would like them to have a vaccine and get one fairly quickly. The prospect of these vaccines being unrolled without any possibility of a majority of the world getting them is genuinely heartbreaking. And that's the anger that partly prompted that piece. The irony, of course, is that this is such a dramatically different situation from the 1950s when the flu vaccine was developed by Jonas Salk, who, of course, famously said, when asked by Ed Murrow about whether he was going to patent his invention, he said, can you patent the sun? And it's a heartbreak. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful moment. It's a really beautiful moment. And
that was about the polio vaccine.
I'm sorry, that was about the polio vaccine. That's exactly right. And that's about the polio vaccine. The tradition of Jonas Salk, however, does continue with the flu vaccine that we all take. That flu vaccine is developed at a unit of the WHO, which is called informally the Flu Network and formally the Global Influenza Surveillance and Research Systems. It's a collaborative infrastructure that they've set up at the WHO that involves 110 different countries, 130 different laboratories, which pool information on what strains of influenza are circulating in their countries. That information is collated, and every year for 2 different flu seasons in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the WHO then releases what would be called the formula for the flu vaccine, which then anyone, anywhere can produce because it's completely free of any proprietary intellectual property or monopoly, which means that billions of people have taken it since the 1970s based on this cooperative shared system of pooling knowledge as well as finances. And that's created a very robust infrastructure for the production and consumption of these flu vaccines. And it's a great success. It's unfortunately exactly the kind of thing that's not being replicated with the coronavirus vaccines.
Well, Achal Praval, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the refusal of these handful of rich countries to allow the suspension of intellectual property rights at the WTO, what is their argument? Given the enormous worldwide crisis that we're functioning, how do they defend this, and what could possibly be done to overcome this resistance?
I wish actually sometimes that people would just be honest and upfront and say, look, we actually care about these corporations more than global human life. We're actually fine with a certain number of usually poor people dying for a lack of access to these vaccines as long as the companies and the industry that makes them survives. I'd be willing to listen to that argument because it at least would be honest. What happens instead is that the arguments that are advanced are, A, that it's not a problem. To say that it's not a problem ignores 20 years of human history where millions of people died because of lack of access to monopoly drugs for AIDS, and then did so again for lack of access to drugs for cancer, and then did so again for lack of access to hepatitis C drugs. and by the way, are doing today in the United States for lack of access to insulin, which is again patented, for a lack of access to PrEP, for AIDS, or for a lack of access to cystic fibrosis drugs in the UK. So it's to deny reality. But the logic that's advanced is that the innovation system requires these monopolies to exist in order to reward private pharmaceutical corporations for taking big risks with private money. Except for the fact that that's not what's happening here. It's never happened, but it's never happened as starkly as it is not happening in the pandemic. Moderna, which is just one of the vaccines that posted successful results a couple of weeks ago, has admitted in its own financial reports that 100% of its vaccine development project was funded by BARDA, by Warp Speed and the U.S. government, U.S. taxpayer money. On top of that, it's been given pre-orders of another $1.5 billion from the United States and another substantial amount of money, nearing about $1 billion, from the European Union. Every other vaccine, from Pfizer to AstraZeneca, also has substantial government money. German taxpayer money of up to $445 million went into the Pfizer vaccine. AstraZeneca received huge subsidies through public money from the United Kingdom through its early development at Oxford University. All of these vaccines have, on top of that, received these very lucrative, very large pre-orders. Now, you can't have it all ways. You cannot have a vaccine project literally contracted out. I hesitate to say subsidy because when it's 100% of the cost, that's not a subsidy, that's ownership. You cannot have a prize like a pre-order of $6 billion, which is basically what Pfizer has awaiting it on successful completion of its trials and approval. And on top of that, say, but we also need the intellectual property monopoly because of all this private capital we've risked, which doesn't seem to actually exist. It is very, very strange, but this is the argument that's being advanced. It doesn't hold water. I think they understand that as well. It's just that this argument has a rich history. It's embedded in a particular kind of thinking, a particular branch of economics, which they know that they can ride on and, in effect, lie their way through opposing what is really a very sensible and unradical proposal made by South Africa and India at the WTO.
I wanted to ask Dr. Kamal Yani again about the situation with the Trump administration had removed the United States from the World Health Organization. President-elect Biden is now saying he will return the U.S. to the WHO. What do you think has been the impact of the United States pulling out of the WHO in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, I mean, what do you say about such an amazing, really, incredible, irresponsible, I'm afraid, decision in the middle of the pandemic to do that? I mean, it's strange decision, even if we're not in pandemic. So what do you think if we are in the middle of it? It's really, really not very good. My dream, to be honest, as a non-American about your election is to retain two things. One, the American role in advancing global health and particularly in joining the WHO, and also putting science before politics. This has been also very, very problematic from the U.S. It really affected not just decision makers in other countries, but also ordinary people. This ignoring the science behind COVID was really, really bad. So we do hope that the new administration, they made commitment, Biden made a commitment to join the WHO. That is fantastic. The sooner, the better, that would be great. But also for the U.S. to join something like, or to voice public support for something like this technology access pool that WHO and other countries co-sponsored, to do the facilitation of licensing intellectual property, and so managing intellectual property, that your previous question, but also facilitating technology transfer to other companies. So supporting the CTAP would be absolutely fantastic.
Finally, how exactly, summing up in a minute, if you got around trade secrets, if the companies were forced to release their trade secrets, they didn't get patents on this, how would a people's vaccine work? Every company all over could just develop the vaccine where it is. What's shocking, President Trump signed some executive order, not clear how enforceable it is, called America First. We have learned, if you're altruistic or not, if someone is sick somewhere in the world, you are in danger. So everyone is in this together. But what would a people's vaccine, how would it happen?
What it requires is, firstly, for companies to say there are two aspects of our monopoly that we'll give up. We'll share with you our patents and we'll share with you our trade secrets. Trade secrets are the know-how and the technology that's required to make a vaccine. It's a very important part of the process. If they were to say, look, we'll license this to any company with a reputation and a quality certification that's willing to make this vaccine with us, then let's open it up and let's have anyone interested do it. And if they did that, they would suddenly find that there are whole avenues of supply that open up around the world. There are over 20 vaccine manufacturers in India, but there are also 8 vaccine manufacturers on the continent of Africa. And there are a number of ways in which you can do this collaboratively. The one way not to do it is the way that they are, by producing these artificially limited quantities of these vaccines by sort of keeping it all to themselves.
Achal Prabhala, coordinator of Access IBSA project, speaking to us from Bangalore, India. Thanks also to Dr. Moga Kameliane of the People's Vaccine Alliance. When we come back, we'll speak to one of the world's leading infectious disease doctors, Paul Farmer.
Vim aqui só pra dizer ninguém há de me calar. Se alguém tem que morrer, que seja pra melhorar. Tanta vida pra viver, tanta vida se acabar, com tanto pra se fazer, com tanto pra se salvar. Você que não me entendeu, não perde por esperar.
Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our coverage of the COVID-19 crisis, we turn now to the world-renowned infectious disease doctor and medical anthropologist, Dr. Paul Farmer. He's chair of global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School and co-founder of Partners in Health, an international nonprofit that provides direct health care services to those who are sick and living in poverty around the world. Dr. Farmer co-founded the group in 1987 to deliver health care to people in Haiti. In 2014, Partners in Health was one of the first organizations to respond to the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Dr. Farmer's new book is titled Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History. I spoke to him in early December and asked him how it's possible for the United States to have nearly 20% of the world's infections and deaths while having less than 5% of the world's population?
Well, I mean, we are facing the consequences of decades and decades of underinvestment in public health and of centuries of misallocation of funds away from those who need that help most. And, all the social pathologies of our nation come to the fore during epidemics, and during a pandemic like this one, we're going to be showing the rest of the world, warts and all, how we have shown the rest of the world how badly we can do. And now we have to rally, use new tools that are coming online, but address some of the older pathologies of our care delivery system and of our country. I think that's where we are right now.
What needs to happen right now in the United States?
Well, first of all, I think that it's a great tragedy that such matters as masking or social distancing or even shutting down parts of the economy that contribute to risk but are it's just a shame that that's been politicized. These are not political or partisan actions. They're public health strategies. Right now, they're all we've got. But even when the vaccine is online or begins to come online, we have no history of seeing a vaccine taken up so rapidly that it would alter the fundamental dynamics of a respiratory illness like this. So we're facing, as President-elect Biden said, a long, dark winter. And if we can make a difference that could spare tens of thousands and perhaps more than 150,000 lives, then we should do that. And whether or not these are called mask mandates or pleading from the president, we need state and local authorities to come together and underline the nonpartisan and life-saving nature of some of these basic protective measures. We need to invest very heavily in making sure the vaccine goes to those who need it most and those who've been shut out of previous developments like this or shut out for too long. So we have a lot of work ahead of us this winter, but no small amount of it is going to rely on individual families and communities to take up some of these measures rapidly to make sure that the dark winter does not lead to a blighted spring.
Dr. Farmer, can you comment quickly on these vaccines for people to understand the first, what's called mRNA, messenger RNA vaccines, what they actually do in the human body? Do they make you immune, or you can get sick and be a carrier, but you yourself, you mean you can be infected and be a carrier, but you yourself will not get very sick? Explain the choice of who gets the vaccine, also the fact that this has not been studied in children, people under 14, and so what this means for kids.
Well, in general terms, let me just say that in the 30-plus years I've been involved in this work, I've never seen such a rapid development of a novel preventive for a novel vaccine. So there's a lot to celebrate in terms of the global effort to come together to develop new vaccines. Again, in general terms, the idea is that instead of having a natural infection, in this case, breathing in the novel coronavirus and getting sick, which leads to the outcomes that we know, death or recovery with sequelae, it also leads probably to immunity. That's what it's like with other viral infections in humans, or almost all of them. So what the vaccine does is introduce something that will trick the body into believing that it's being invaded by the virus. In this case, it's focused on a particular protein on the outer surface of the virus, and generate that immune response, which is often robust and enduring, at least with other viruses. Now, in the case of any novel pathogen, we don't know for sure how long that immunity lasts, right? I mean, how could you? It hasn't been studied for long. But we know about other viruses and can take some lessons from those. And in the case of this new vaccine, or this new type of vaccines, the mRNA vaccine, we're also dealing with that unknown. This is a new kind of vaccination. This is a new approach. It's very exciting, in part because it seems to confer that immunity without significant adverse effects. So I think, again, on the side of development of a novel technology, these vaccines, whether mRNA vaccines or others, are great news, right? And maybe they will influence a new generation of vaccines for other pathogens, particularly viral pathogens, which tend to be the worst ones among humans. So that's where we are with the development of new technology. Unfortunately, as I said, and as you've underlined many times, Amy, the old pathologies of our society make it unlikely that the rollout will be smooth and evenly taken up across various communities, some of them with well-founded fears and mistrust of any kind of public health campaign. So we're in a bit of a pickle. I'm optimistic about what will happen in this country, but as you pointed out in opening up the hour, a lot of us are concerned with what's going to happen in the global south, and among those who might as well be considered living in the global south in wealthy and egalitarian countries like the United States and parts of Europe. So it's going to be a rocky winter with some highs and lows, and I hope there are more highs than lows. I hope there's more reason for celebration than for grief, but I think it's going to be a very, very difficult winter.
Just before we go to this remarkable book about dealing with Ebola and what it meant, I wanted to ask you about property rights, about patents, and about countries like in South Africa and India pushing for a temporary suspension of intellectual property rights and patents so that COVID-19 vaccines and medications become more accessible, particularly in the global south.
Well, I'd just like to say something we've had a chance to discuss before in previous years. You know, when you look at what happened around HIV, which, you know, by 1995, 96, those of us in the infectious disease world understood that this would be a life-saving suppressive therapy. Like, as with diabetes, requiring insulin, you'd have to keep taking it, but this would save millions of lives and maybe even more and prevent transmission of mother to child. The same debates about intellectual property, of course, came up then. The average wholesale price for a 3-drug regimen in the years immediately after the discovery of these new agents was $15,000, sometimes $20,000 per person per year. So if you split your time between Harvard and Haiti, as I had and do, you would imagine, if you couldn't have an imagination beyond conventional property rights discussion, that the majority of the world would be shut out of access to this therapy. And of course, that made the most difference on a continent level in Africa, where the majority of people living with HIV and dying with HIV were at the time. And what happened later was the production of generic versions of these drugs, often in India or China or even South Africa, right, so that a much lower cost could be tied to the same agents. And when I say much lower, I mean a reduction really even within those early years from 15 to 20,000 to about $300 per person per year. And with groups like the Clinton Foundation getting involved, those prices dropped even further. And right now you can get a really good 3-drug regimen, even with some pediatric formulations for children, for about $60 per patient per year. So that you could say that took a long time, but it didn't take a long time in terms of the impact that it could have. Millions and millions of lives, maybe even 16 to 20 million lives are being saved by these drugs. But in some places like Rwanda, where I've spent 10 years, you saw the virtual eradication of AIDS among children. Because if mom is on therapy, the transmission to babies in utero or through breastfeeding probably really does not occur. And this is not a hypothetical development. This has already happened in Rwanda, which is a very poor country with a very robust public health and care delivery system.
Dr. Paul Farmer will return to our interview in a moment and talk about his new book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our conversation with Dr. Paul Farmer, infectious disease doctor, renowned medical anthropologist, co-founder and chief strategist of Partners in Health, author of the new book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History. Between 2014 and 16, Ebola killed more than 11,000 people, most in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. I asked Dr. Farmer to talk about his new book and his work in West Africa during the Ebola crisis.
Well, you know, I wrote the book, a lot of it in Sierra Leone. And as chance would have it, and I think we talked about this in 2014, I was in Sierra Leone in June of 2014, but for an unrelated matter, I was there for a surgical conference, and which I was involved in part in organizing. And I remember folks coming to the conference saying, you know, there's already Ebola in the neighboring countries. Should we really have it as a safe venue? And my response was that you don't get Ebola through medical conferences, but through caregiving, that is, nursing the sick and burying the dead, and that we would be okay. Shortly after that, I left, went back home to Rwanda. And as you will recall, my colleague, Humar Khan, Sierra Leone's leading infectious disease doctor, died of the disease on July 29th. And I began lobbying my own friends and coworkers to join in on the fight. And so I will add, Amy, that we were very tardy to get there, in my view, and arrived in October. And what I saw then in both Liberia and Sierra Leone was just terrifying. It's not like there's a terror with a respiratory virus that's invisible. That terror comes when someone is sick and fell ill. But there in the midst of this clinical desert, you know, there were times when we saw people collapse in the street and knew that it was likely or possibly from Ebola. And with some shame, you know, waited for those fully masked and gowned to come and help people. Now, that was not during the time which would follow in a couple of weeks in the Ebola treatment units and community care centers and abandoned public hospitals. We're still doing a lot of that work today. But the reason I wrote the book was I got to know a number of patients quite well. And as they recovered, we became very often friends. That initial group that I met in October and some that I met in Ebola treatment units in the course of the worst weeks of the epidemic. And one of them, a young man named Ibrahim, on the night that I met him, told me that he had lost more than 20 members of his family to Ebola and asked me to interview him. And even though, as you point out, I'm an anthropologist as well as a physician, that was a very unusual kind of experience to have someone who just had experienced such loss and was still recovering to make such a request. And that kind of convinced me that these stories from West Africa and the history of the place would be an important thing for me to learn about. And that was the genesis of the book.
And so talk about Ebola, the outbreak, and then how it was contained. You talk about it as the caregiver's disease.
Well, Ebola, like the coronavirus, is an RNA virus, and also likely both are zoonoses. That is, they come from other species, animal species, and then leap into humans. And if you look, stand back and look, a lot of the diseases that cause the highest number of deaths among humans have these zoonotic roots, and Ebola is one of those. Its natural host is still disputed. It may be a bat. That seems plausible. But in the midst of all that, its origins in what species it came from was not really the task at hand. The task at hand there was stopping transmission from person to person, because once introduced into the human family, Ebola spreads easily through contact, and the two main sources of exposure are caregiving. First, nursing the sick, cleaning up after them. And second, the last act of caregiving in most parts of the world and in most religious traditions is burying the dead. And those were causing the transmission. Now, the problem there, unlike the United States, is that there were not professional caregivers and there were not professional undertakers or morticians. So, of course, family members and traditional healers had to fill in that gap. And that's why so many people got sick and so many traditional healers got sick. And then, of course, the professional caregivers also experienced enormous risks. It wasn't just Dr. Khan. It was thousands and thousands of nurses, laboratory technicians, ambulance drivers, and doctors. And of the 1,000 or so that got sick during that time, probably more than half of them died. So that's again, another huge loss for any country. But if you're living in the medical desert and don't have a lot of physicians and nurses and lab techs and ambulance drivers, it's really something. Going back to the UN Secretary General's comments about COVID, the effects of that will be felt for years and decades if we don't step in and work to build those health systems again.
Certainly,
I don't know if that's
certainly, as we've learned, dealing with health, with epidemics, with pandemics, if people have any questions about whether altruism is a motivation, we just understand we are all connected. You, Dr. Farmer, talk in your book about colonization, the slave trade, the catastrophic consequences on African nations. Talk about, though this is not usually talked about in health terms, you put the two together.
Yeah. Well, let me just start, Amy, by saying that during the epidemic, the great majority of our attention, and certainly mine, was on the clinical response. That is, trying to make sure that Ebola treatment units, at least the ones with which we were affiliated, were not only places for isolation, but places for care. And care for Ebola is not rocket science, even without what are called specific therapies, like an antiviral, like remdesivir, for example, for COVID. Even without specific therapies, the interventions that are required to save the lives of the majority of Ebola patients are to replace the fluids that they've lost through nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, right, the torrid heat of the area. All those losses of fluids and electrolytes are what really imperil the lives of those sick with Ebola in the short term. And we have therapies for that. They've been around for 100 years. They've been improved over time. These oral rehydration salts, which you probably call Pedialyte, are important. And for those who cannot take oral medications because they're nauseated or vomiting or in a coma, there are IV solutions that can save lives in that manner. And even that was not happening across the region. And there were reasons for that, right? People were frightened And anything that involved a sharp, that is a needle to put in an IV, for example, or a blood draw, poses some risk to healthcare workers, right? But it would have been better just to say, hey, we're frightened, because anyone in a right mind would be frightened. But instead, we started having arguments about what kind of care was the appropriate care. And the arguments, I mean, especially within the internet, what are called the international actors, which doesn't mean Academy Award-winning actors, but the NGOs and humanitarian groups that had flooded this region after the civil wars that afflicted it for some time, and then returned, obviously sometimes a different cast of characters, including ones that we know well, like the CDC, came back just a decade after this conflict ended to be involved in the Ebola response. And I've made the argument in the book that the response was hampered by the fact that the attention was largely to containment, not to care. And of course, this generated very painful echoes from colonial rule, which in that part of the world was largely a 20th century phenomenon. This is not remote history, as you know. So in order to improve the quality of containment efforts, we should have focused more on the quality of care. We're going to face that when the next epidemic of Ebola comes along.
Your description of people, the life histories of the Ebola survivors is deeply moving. Can you talk about Ibrahim Kamara and Yabom Koroma, some of the people that you dedicate this book to?
Well, it's not always been easy to talk about them because, they endured such losses and they were not easy to hear about. Of course, having been involved in their care, I thought I knew something about their losses, but it turns out there were many more. And I had an epiphany, which I'm embarrassed to share. But of course, it wasn't long before we understood that every adult patient that we cared for who survived Ebola or didn't had also survived a brutal civil war. And when I started talking with Ibrahim, who is the very man I mentioned earlier, who's the person really in a way who inspired me to write this book, I couldn't believe the details and spent many, many months and in the case of Yabom, years interviewing and learning about them. And of course, this happens over time. But Yabom's story was different. If I could just go back and say Ibrahim was probably 26 when he fell ill with Ebola and did not have children of his own. His most grievous losses were his mother, his siblings, family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Yabom, on the other hand, was 39, and she lost, in addition to her husband, some of her children, her mother also, and other family members. And what I learned about these two was that they moved between villages and the capital city during the war, after the war, and even during the epidemic, because very often they were called to perform those caregiving services for afflicted members of their family. And again, in the case of those who perished, and who was going to bury them at the time that they fell ill. And this was in August of 2014. So they faced these impossible choices. Another reason it was difficult and painful to write about them, choices that I've never faced, like, do we respect our mother's dying wish to be buried in her home village? And of course, that was also against the recommendations of public health authorities. But there wasn't enough in the way of assistance with caregiving or with respectful burial of the dead until later in the epidemic. And so their compassion led to their own infections and to infections among other members of their families. Now, I will add, Amy, that, of course, I'm still friends with these people, and they've recovered to varying extents. Yabom almost lost her eyesight as well because, as I think we discussed when we were together in August of 2014 to talk about Ebola, one of the complications is a blinding inflammation that can be readily treated with steroids and eye drops that cost, pennies or $1 to save someone's vision. So there were lots of complications, to say nothing of grief and psychological and emotional complications. There were lots of complications that endured in the months after the epidemic was brought under control.
Dr. Farmer, you write that every American and most Europeans who fell ill with Ebola in West Africa survived. Different mortality outcomes emerged from the same strain of Ebola, depending on care that was or wasn't available, depending on your country of origin. If you can explain this and then expand that to what we are seeing today in this country, for example, also on the issue of racial differentials and disparities.
Well, this is something that I encourage my students to grapple with, or our trainees in clinical medicine, which is case fatality rate. Because case fatality rate is a report card on the quality of the medical system, right? And there are many parts to that. Referral to a clinical facility able to manage complications. And we're going to be facing the same challenge in the coming weeks. If hospitals become saturated, if we don't flatten the curve, then they become overwhelmed. And not only do they perform more poorly in terms of caring for those sickened by the pandemic, or in the case of Ebola, the epidemic, they also fail to provide the services that people need for other problems, other illnesses and injuries. And we saw a lot of that during Ebola, but we've also seen it in the United States once our hospitals in New England and New York became overwhelmed. And that's, of course, exactly what happened in West Africa as well. It just happened earlier and more devastatingly. But that's just the first part of the equation. Case fatality rate is a marker, a report card on what happens after you get infected, right? We also have racial disparities and other social disparities, as you've noted, in risk of infection. So all along that noxious path, we have to make interventions that lessen the risk for infection, but also that lessen the risk for a bad outcome once infected. And I think that is the goal before us with COVID-19, just as it was a goal during Ebola. Now, why am I bringing this up as a controversial matter? Because if the report card is only about disease control, that is stopping the epidemic, and not about survival once infected, why is it that people would go to an Ebola treatment unit to be isolated if they fear they will not receive care? And the answer is they won't, right? And this was not new. Treatment centers and treatment units that were really isolation and quarantine facilities proliferated across the continent of Africa under colonial rule and remained a feature there even after the end of colonial rule. And that pathology of focusing on disease control over care, I think, really weakened the epidemic.
Dr. Paul Farmer, author of the new book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History. He's chair of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, co-founder and chief strategist of Partners in Health, also featured in the documentary Bending the Arc. That does it for today's show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Jarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamaria Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, and Adriano Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, Aaron Dooley, David Prude, and Dennis McCormick. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.